Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
There are whispers in the marshes and melodies in the tides of the southeastern United States. They echo through the moss-draped trees of South Carolina and Georgia's Sea Islands, carrying tales of a people who have preserved an African-American cultural legacy that is as resilient as it is rare. This is the world of the Gullah Geechee, descendants of enslaved Africans who forged a unique culture defined by language, food, music, spirituality, and in a little-known but fascinating chapter of their history by Judaism. The connection between Judaism and the Gullah Geechee people is one of those stories that has been buried under layers of time and trauma, its pieces scattered like artifacts across the Lowcountry. To understand how Judaism made its way into the soul of Gullah Geechee culture, we must traverse oceans and centuries, moving from ancient Israel to West Africa, from West Africa to the plantations of the American South, and finally into the present-day enclaves where Gullah identity still pulses, quietly but firmly. The idea that Judaism could have found a home within the Gullah Geechee people may seem improbable at first glance, but history has always been far more complicated than what is printed in textbooks. In truth, the spiritual and cultural fabric of the Gullah Geechee people is woven with threads that stretch back to West Africa, where traces of Hebraic practices existed long before the Middle Passage ever began. Across parts of West Africa, particularly among groups such as the Yoruba, Ashanti, and the Igbo, there were documented customs and laws that bore striking resemblance to ancient Hebrew traditions. Scholars and travelers, including Christian missionaries and colonial administrators, remarked on rituals that mirrored Jewish dietary laws, rites of circumcision, purification practices, and even the observance of rest days. In Nigeria, for instance, many Igbo communities practiced male circumcision on the 8th day, followed certain dietary taboos, and celebrated agricultural festivals that aligned with Hebraic calendars. These practices were not influenced by Christian or Islamic missionaries but predated colonial contact, suggesting either a distant cultural diffusion or even deeper ancestral connections. When enslaved Africans were brought to the American South, especially to coastal regions like the Sea Islands, many came from these very ethnic groups. The transatlantic slave trade was not just a forced movement of people, it was a transplantation of memory, belief, and tradition. The enslaved were stripped of their freedom, but not of their heritage. On the rice plantations of South Carolina and Georgia, the isolation of the Gullah Geechee communities allowed them to retain a surprising amount of African culture, which was often erased or suppressed elsewhere in the American South. Within this preserved cultural continuity, we find spiritual practices that strongly resemble both African religion and ancient Judaic traditions. The Gullah people, for example, hold sacred the oral transmission of history, much like the Jewish tradition of passing down Torah knowledge through generations. Their reverence for ancestors mirrors the Jewish practice of honoring forebears and recalling their names in ritual and prayer. The Gullah practice of removing shoes in sacred spaces, their dietary taboos, and even their burial customs, such as covering mirrors during mourning or placing personal items at graves, bear uncanny parallels to Jewish mourning rituals. Furthermore, in the early colonial South, there was a small but significant population of Sephardic Jews, many of whom had fled the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal and found refuge in Charleston, South Carolina, which by the 18th century had one of the largest Jewish populations in North America. These Jewish settlers, some of whom were involved in trade and plantation ownership, came into contact with enslaved Africans. In this close, though unequal, proximity, cultural exchanges occurred. While some of this contact was certainly exploitative, there were also moments of spiritual and cultural diffusion. Enslaved people working in Jewish households might have been exposed to Hebrew prayers, Shabbat customs, or the reading of Torah. Over time, fragments of these rituals could have been absorbed and recontextualized within African traditions. But there's more. Oral testimonies from Gullah elders speak of certain old ways that sound eerily similar to Judaic beliefs. One such testimony described an elder who refused to eat pork, observed rest days, and sang in a language described as sounding like the Psalms. There are also Gullah stories that recount a people who came from across the waters with knowledge of stars, seasons, and laws handed down by a god of fire and mountain. These are not the teachings of the American South's Christian Sunday schools. These are echoes of Sinai. In more recent decades, some Gullah families have begun to explore or reclaim Jewish identity, tracing oral traditions back to African ancestors believed to be of Hebrew descent. Researchers and cultural historians have worked with Gullah communities to piece together these connections, finding linguistic traces in Gullah Creole that suggest ancient Semitic roots. Words like Yah or Abba occasionally surface in spiritual songs and chants, terms with strong resonance in both African and Hebrew liturgy. Though such evidence must be treated with scholarly caution, it adds to a growing chorus of voices suggesting a buried history now being rediscovered. This reclamation is more than an academic exercise. It's a spiritual journey. For some, it has led to formal conversion to Judaism or to the embrace of Hebraic roots through African-centered Hebrew Israelite traditions. For others, it remains a cultural memory, respected but not necessarily formalized. What is crucial, however, is that this intersection of Judaism and Gullah Geechee culture challenges the narrow ways we have often thought about religious identity, African American heritage, and the afterlives of African spiritual systems. Critics may ask whether these connections are coincidental or constructed. But the weight of oral tradition, ethnographic detail, and historical circumstance suggests otherwise. Judaism in the Gullah context did not arrive solely through European proselytism or post-slavery religious awakenings. It was embedded in African traditions before the ships ever set sail. It arrived hidden in memory and ritual, in the subconscious grooves of a people who were forced to forget, but never fully did. Today, as Gullah Geechee communities fight to preserve their lands, languages, and legacies from coastal gentrification and cultural erasure, the rediscovery of these Judaic connections adds yet another layer to their rich identity. It affirms that the story of the African diaspora is far more intricate than the binaries of black and white, Christian and non-Christian, slave and free. It reminds us that within the Gullah Geechee soul lives a vast ocean of ancestral memory, where Africa and Israel, Moses and Mend, Torah and Tale, all coexist beneath the tidal rhythms of survival. The story of Judaism in Gullah Geechee culture is not just about religion. It is about resilience. It is about a people who held on to the fragments of their shattered world and reassembled them into a spiritual mosaic that continues to shine centuries later. To study, it is to be humbled by the endurance of memory and the mystery of how faith travels, over oceans, through chains, and into the hearts of those determined never to forget.